In 1893, a dam operator named Henry Thibodeau stood on a timber splash dam in northern Maine, his hand on the iron trip lever. Behind him, 3 million board feet of spruce logs were stacked 20 feet deep in a mountain stream. The dam held back 8 million gallons of water. When Thibodeau pulled the lever, the entire dam collapsed in seconds, and a man-made flood carrying millions of pounds of timber roared downstream at 30 miles per hour. This was how America moved logs in places where no railroad could reach. They built dams specifically to destroy them. I've been walking the old stream beds in the Penobscot country and down along the spruce forks of the Aroostook. You can still find the cribs. Square-notched timbers rotted black, half buried in gravel, iron bolts rusted through but still holding their grip on hemlock that's older than any man alive. The locals call them fish ladders. They weren't. They were splash dams, and every one of them was built to be blown. If you care about the men who did the work nobody wrote down, the dam tenders and the river drivers and the boys who watched 1,000 tons of water scream past their boots, please subscribe to Global Old History. This channel lives on subscribers. Hit the button. Then stay with me, because what the splash dam crews did in the backcountry of Maine and Oregon and Washington is one of the strangest pieces of American industry I have ever tried to understand. Henry Thibodeau was born in 1,859 inches, a French-Canadian settlement near Fort Kent, up where the St. John River bends down out of Quebec. His father was a riverman. His grandfather had been a riverman in the old country before that. Henry went into the woods at 14 with a beanhole pot and a pair of caulked boots, 2 sizes too big, handed down from an uncle who had drowned in the Allagash the winter before. By 1893, he was running his own splash dam on a feeder creek above Ashland, Maine, 44 years old, 5 children at home. A wife named Marie who read him letters from the parish priest because Henry had never learned English letters and only a little French. Here is the problem Thibodeau and every dam tender like him had to solve. I want you to picture it, because it sits at the heart of this whole story. A logging crew spends all winter up on a mountain ridge. They drop spruce and hemlock and pine. They buck the trunks into 1/6 foot lengths. They yard the logs to the nearest frozen stream on horse-drawn sleds. By April, there are 3 or 4 million board feet of timber stacked along a creek bed so small you could step across it in summer without getting your boots wet. The sawmill is 40 miles downstream. There is no road. There is no railroad. There is no flat car that will ever reach that creek. And the creek, when the snow melts, will carry a single log a mile before it grounds on a gravel bar. 2 miles, if you are lucky. The water is not deep enough. The current is not strong enough. A spring freshet might move a few hundred logs, and then the creek drops, and the rest of your winter's cut sits there drying in the sun, turning from lumber into fence post. So what do? You make the flood yourself. That is the whole idea of the splash dam. You build a timber wall across the creek in a narrow place, tall enough to back up a pond 3 or 4 acres wide. You let the snowmelt fill it. You yard your logs into the pond above the dam all winter. And when the pond is full, and the logs are floating, and the downstream water is already running high, you pull the trip, the dam falls, and 8 million gallons of water and 3 million board feet of spruce go down that creek together at a speed God never intended water to move. Before I tell you how the dam itself was built, because the engineering is small and strange and beautiful, do me one favor. Hit the subscribe button. The algorithm buries this kind of history unless you tell it to stop. 1 click, then come back for the trip lever. A splash dam was not a reservoir dam. It was not a Hoover dam. It was not even a mill pond dam. It was a throwaway, built to stand 1 season, maybe 2, and then be broken on purpose. The crews who raised them used the trees on the banks. A dam boss would pick a narrow gut in the stream, with rock ledge on both sides if he could get it, and stake out a crib 20 or 30 feet high, and as long as the gut was wide. They felled spruce and hemlock uphill, squared them with broad axes, notched them at the corners like a log cabin wall, stacked the squared logs into cribs, hollow timber boxes bolted together with iron drifts, and filled the cribs with creek stone and gravel so the weight would hold the whole structure against the water. The face toward the pond was planked tight with hemlock boards and caulked with tar and oakum. In the center of the dam was the sluice gate. The sluice was the whole trick. A rectangular opening about 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall dropped straight through the dam, closed off by a heavy hinged timber gate. The gate was held shut by an iron latch on a trip line. When the dam tender pulled the trip line, the latch dropped. The water pressure behind the dam, 20 feet of head or more, kicked the gate open in under a second, and the pond began to empty. You have to understand what that looks like. I have read descriptions from 3 different Maine river drivers who wrote about it in old age, in pencil, in notebooks their grandchildren kept. They all say the same thing. The first sound is not the water. The first sound is the logs. The logs in the pond start to move even before the water level drops. They move because the whole surface tilts toward the sluice. A pond 3 acres wide tilts itself like a tabletop, and every floating log slides for the center. The men on the banks hear the logs grinding against each other, a sound like 1,000 axe handles being snapped at once. Then the dam lets go and the roar comes. 30 miles an hour, the water and timber together. Downstream, the creek widens, narrows, bends. The wave rolls through it, taking everything. A deer carcass, a beaver dam, a stranded log from last winter's drive. All of it churns south toward the main river. Men stationed at the bends with pike poles push stray logs back into the current. Men at the landings 15 miles down wait for the first log to arrive and mark the water in their ledgers. A good splash, a clean splash, could move 2 million board feet to the main river in a single afternoon. I want to tell you about the men who did this work, because a dam tender was not just some lumberjack with a lever. He was a specialist. He understood water. He understood how the ice moved in March and how the snowmelt ran in April. He knew to the hour when to pull the trip. Henry Thibodeau was one. I have already told you his name and where he came from. The second man I want you to meet was his right hand, his cribman. His name was Peter Sabatis, age 31 inches, 1,893. A Penobscot from Indian Island, a few miles above Old Town. Peter could read the creek the way Henry could read it, and he could do it in English and in Penobscot both, and he had a particular job nobody else wanted. Peter was the man who swam the pond before the splash. In the hour before the trip, somebody had to row out into the floating timber and cut loose any logs that had grounded against the dam face or jammed against the sluice gate. If a log wedged sideways across the sluice when Henry pulled the trip, the dam would not empty. Or worse, it would burst sideways through the cribs and take the whole structure with it and drown everyone on the downstream bank. Peter did this alone, in a bateau, with a pike pole and a single-bit axe. He stepped from log to log, in water 20 feet deep under his feet, moving a 40-foot pine over here, poling a bundle of spruce over there, chopping through a wedged butt. If a log rolled under him, he went in. The water in an April splash pond is 38 degrees. A man in that water has maybe 4 minutes. Peter Sabatis did this 22 springs in a row. He drew $2.75 a day, which was a good wage in that country in those years. He sent most of it back to Indian Island, where his wife Mary raised 3 daughters in a frame house Peter had built himself out of the first clean pine from the 1,889 splash. He never drowned. He died in 1921 of pneumonia, in bed, in that same frame house. The parish priest in Old Town wrote the date down in a ledger. That is the only paper record of his life I have been able to find. I want to say this plainly. Peter Sabatis had forgotten more about the behavior of moving water than any civil engineer in Boston or Portland ever knew. He could look at a creek in February, when it was iced over and dead quiet, and tell you within a foot where the March freshet would crest. He could stand on the dam, walk in an April dawn, spit into the pond, watch the spit drift, and know if the wind was going to hold the logs at the north end or set them sliding toward the sluice. This was a kind of knowledge nobody wrote down because nobody thought to ask. Men like Peter carried it into the ground with them. The same work happened on the other side of the continent. By 1880, the splash dam had migrated west. In the Coos Bay country of Oregon and up the Coquille, and on the tributaries of the Columbia, timbermen were building dams bigger than anything Maine ever saw. The Oregon dams held back 5 million board feet behind a single sluice. They were cribbed from Douglas fir, a yard across at the butt. Some had 2 sluice gates, some had 3. A big Oregon splash could scour a canyon for 12 miles. I want you to meet one more man, and then we are going to talk about what the splash actually did to the country. The third man was named Eyvind Haugen, Norwegian. Born in Stavanger in 1868. Came through San Francisco in 1889 and walked north looking for spruce work because his father had cut spruce in the old country, and that was all Ivan knew. By 1895, he was a sluice boss on the Upper Coquille, working a dam for the Coquille Mill and Tug Company. He was 27 years old. A sluice boss did not just pull the lever, he lived at the dam. He had a shack on the bank, a wood stove, a single kerosene lantern, a ledger where he wrote down the weather and the water depth every morning at dawn. He watched the pond fill all winter. He watched the logs come in one sled at a time and he counted them. When the spring freshet started, he read the river below the dam every hour and he read the sky. And he waited for the downstream crew to ride up on horseback and tell him the main river was high enough to receive the splash. And when the call came, Ivan Haugen was the one who crossed the dam walk, hand on the iron rail, and pulled the trip. He pulled it 11 times between 1,895 and 1,903. On the 12th pull in May of 1903, the sluice gate jammed half open. A log came up out of the pond sideways and caught the lower corner of the gate and stopped it. Pressure built behind the dam. The crib on the north side, the side Ivan was standing on, cracked at the base and began to tilt. Ivan ran for the bank. He made it 7 steps. The cribs went over. The whole dam let go sideways instead of through the sluice. The flood took Ivan Haugen and a quarter-mile of riverbank forest and 3 bateaux and 2 horses and a downstream landing crew. They found his body 9 miles south, wedged under a root wad, his caulked boots still laced. His widow Sigrid went back to Norway with their 2 children on money raised by a collection among the Scandinavian loggers of Coos County. $340 in gold coin, pressed into an envelope, handed to her at the Astoria dock. That was one dam. There were thousands. Please, if you have stayed with me this far, hit subscribe. The work these men did is not in any book I have found that is still in print. This channel lives or dies on subscribers, and there is a grief part of this story coming that I want you to be here for. By 1910, there were more than 2,000 working splash dams in the state of Maine alone. Oregon had another 400. Washington had 300. West Virginia and Pennsylvania and northern Michigan each had hundreds more. A single river system, the Coquille in Oregon, had 31 splash dams on its tributaries, released in sequence so that the water from the first splash hit the second dam just as the second dam was tripped, doubling the wave, and then tripled it at the third, and so on down to the mill pond at the mouth. A running splash sequence on the Coquille could put 8 million board feet into the mill boom in 36 hours. 8 million. That is 80 miles of log if you laid them end to end, coming down a creek in a single afternoon and night. The mill at the mouth could not swallow that much timber in a day. Nobody ever expected it to. The mill boom, which was a circle of chained-together logs a quarter-mile across, caught the splash and held it. Tugs nosed bundles of 40 logs at a time into the saw pond. The saws ran round the clock for 6 weeks after a big splash. 2 shifts of sawyers, and the bunkhouses smelled of pitch and wet wool and fried onions from the morning to the night. A good Coquille splash in 1898 could keep a single mill in saw logs until Christmas. The dam building itself went fast. A crew of 30 men could raise a 30-foot splash dam across a main creek in 3 weeks, working sunup to dark. Axe work, broadaxe squaring, crib stacking, iron drifting, sluice framing, caulking. No plans on paper. The dam boss carried it in his head. He had built 10 before it and would build 10 after. The design was old when he learned it. French-Canadian in origin, some said. Others said the Maine men had it from their grandfathers who had worked the Kennebec in 1820. Here is the part of this story that sits hardest on me. I have put it off long enough. What the splash dams did to American rivers is something we are still paying for. I am going to say it plain, because it is true, and it belongs in this story, and I promised you a grief beat. Every splash flood scoured the creek bed down to bedrock. The gravel bars where salmon spawned washed away. The cut banks where trout held in shade gouged. The slack water where alewives and shad rested on their runs gone. The whole living structure of 1,000 American streams torn out in a single afternoon and torn out again the next spring, and the spring after that, for 70 years. The Atlantic salmon runs of Maine, which in 1850 had filled every tributary of the Penobscot and the Kennebec with fish thick enough to walk across, were gone by 1900. Gone, not from overfishing, not from pollution alone, from splash dams. The fish could not spawn in a creek that was scoured clean every April, and then blocked by a wall of timber for 6 months of the year. In Oregon, the coho and the chinook that ran the Coquille and the Coos and the Umpqua were cut to a fraction of what they had been. Old men in those coast towns remember, even in my own lifetime, fathers and grandfathers telling them about rivers they could never quite believe had been real. And the old-growth timber the splash dams served, cedar and spruce and Douglas fir that had grown for 500 years, came out of those forests in decades. A working splash dam could move more timber in a single season than the entire state of Maine cut in a year in 1840. We traded the fish and the forest for framing lumber and newsprint. We built cities on it. We built every small-town Main Street in New England and the Pacific Northwest out of wood that rode down a splash flood to a mill pond. And then the dams came down, the timber was gone, and the river was not a river anymore. By 1920, most of the splash dams in New England were finished. The timber above them was cut. The sawmills downstream had closed or moved to the Pacific. In Oregon, the practice continued into the 1950s in some places, and the Oregon Fish Commission finally banned new splash dams in 1956, but the law came 40 years too late for the salmon of the Coast Range. The dams were not removed. They were abandoned. Nobody pulled the sluice gates. Nobody took down the cribs. The companies simply stopped maintaining them. The next big freshet usually took out the sluice and half the face. The cribs behind, filled with rock, stayed in place and are still there now. You can find them on almost any old logging stream in Maine or Oregon. Low dark walls of squared timber, half buried in the bed, iron bolts still gleaming under the waterline. One more ask. If you have come this far with me, subscribe. Please. This kind of history gets buried by the algorithm. Unless enough of you tell it, we want to remember. Hit the button. Then stay for the last beat. I have been down to a splash dam ruin on a tributary of the East Branch of the Penobscot. Last fall. The dam was Henry Thibodeau's, or one very much like it. The iron latch he would have tripped in 1893 was still there in the wreck of the sluice frame. Corroded red, bolted to a piece of hemlock that was still sound because the water had kept it wet for 130 years. I put my hand on it. I thought about Henry in 1893. I thought about Peter Sabattis rowing out into the pond the morning of a splash. I thought about Ivan Haugen in Oregon, running for the bank. I thought about the salmon that used to come up, that creek in silver rafts, thousands a night, and do not come up anymore. All of it from one iron latch and a timber wall. There was a pride in this work. I do not want to leave that out. The men who built splash dams, and the men who tripped them, and the men who rode the splash downstream on top of a spinning spruce log with a pike pole in their hands, were doing something no engineer had designed and no college had taught. They read water, they read wood, they read the sky in April, and knew to the hour when the freshet would peak. They moved millions of tons of timber with nothing but gravity and a latch. And they built the frames of 10,000 houses that are still standing in Boston and Portland and Astoria and Portland, Oregon. Still standing, still holding up a roof, because a man named Henry, or Peter, or Ivan pulled a trip line on a creek in the mountains in 1893. Nobody rebuilt the dam after Ivan Haugens went over in 1903. The company cut around the wreck, moved a mile upstream, built a new one. They did the same thing for 50 years. When the timber ran out, they walked away. The sawmill at the mouth of the Coquille burned in 1937. The rails to the landing were pulled up in 1941 for scrap. The last river driver on the Coquille died in 1968. His name was Olaf Haugen, Ivan's son. He had come back from Norway as a young man in 1920, looking for the river where his father went under, and he had found it, and he had stayed. I do not know what Olaf Haugen thought standing on that stream bank. The records do not say. But he spent 48 years as a mill hand and a riverman on the Coquille, and when he died, the local paper ran 4 lines about him. And in those 4 lines it said that his father had died on the river in 1903, and that Olaf had worked the same water all his life. That is the splash dam story. 2,000 inches Maine, 400 inches Oregon, thousands more across the country, tens of thousands of men who built them, tripped them, rode the floods, and died on them. Millions of fish gone. Billions of board feet of old-growth timber moved to the sawmills. The frames of American cities. The stream beds scoured for 70 years. One iron latch, still bolted to a piece of hemlock. In a creek nobody visits except a man with a camera and too many questions. Tell me in the comments if one of your own people, a grandfather, a great-uncle, a name in a family Bible, worked the river drives or the dam crews. I read every comment. I answer as many as I can. I will see you in the next one.